So thanks for tuning in. And for those who are new to First Saturday, welcome. Um, so the title of today's presentation is Spice It Up, How the Chili Pepper Flavored Chinese Culture. And our speaker today is Professor Brian Dott, Associate Professor of History at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington.
I'm delighted to be here. Hope to spice up your mornings a little bit with talking about chili peppers in Chinese culture and Chinese history. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see my slides. All right, so hopefully you can see that now. So I'll let me go to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so sort of an overall question that I'll be responding to during this talk, which is essentially an overview of my book, is how did chilies come to be used daily in China? And then how did they also impact things beyond just the cuisine? And a key answer to that is sort of the nature of the chili pepper itself. The Chinese recognized and exploited and built on the versatility of chilies. And we can see that here in this outline of what I'm going to be touching on today, and that the chili pepper was used as a decorative plant in China, obviously also as a flavoring, but also in food, it moves beyond just as a flavoring. It's also used as a vegetable in a number of dishes. It also gets integrated into Chinese medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, which I argue is a key factor in its rising popularity as it's integrated into China. And then it also gets incorporated into imagery. So this is for festivals and then also in literature. And then I'll wrap things up and open things up for questions. So I'll begin with a brief background. So probably most of you know that chili pepper is native to the Americas, particularly Central America and Northern South America. And therefore, it does not move outside the Americas until after Columbus's voyage. And probably he did not take it back to Spain until his second voyage. So probably it got to Spain in 1494. It's important for understanding the movement of the chili from the Americas to China that chilies were not a world trade commodity until the 20th century. And so there are not ships with cargoes full of crates of chilies moving from Mexico to China, for example. That's just not something that's happening. Columbus hoped that he could capitalize on chilies as a trade item, but they did not take off. They get to, as I said, Spain around probably in 1494. Initially in Spain, they are not adopted in the cuisine. And the initial use of them was actually the most popular use was in monastery gardens. So they're used as a decorative plant, which is an interesting parallel we'll see shortly for China, early introduction in China. We get to India around 1530, where they do very, pretty much immediately get integrated into the cuisine. Into Malacca, which is in modern day Indonesia, around 1540. And then it gets a little hazier exactly when they got to China. So You can see I have at the top of the screen, Capsicum annuum. That is one of several species of chili peppers. And to the best of our knowledge, and particularly botanists who are more informed than I am on plant species, they argue that is the only species of chili that's introduced into China probably up until the 20th century. But it's important to remember that that species includes a very large range of types of chilies, from the very non-spicy bell pepper to some fairly spicy peppers. And based on my research and also some research by Chinese scholars looking at the introduction of chilies into China, and this is typical of new crops being introduced anywhere, there's multiple entry points and probably fits and stops of starts up of the chili being introduced into particular areas. So the earliest known record, which I'll show you shortly, is from 1591, and it's from Zhejiang province, actually Hangzhou. And that, I mean, for me, that was a surprise, because if you think about it, Columbus, 1494, bringing them back to Spain, and then less than, just under 100 years later, they worked their way all the way around the world. And then a separate introduction up in the north, in Shenjing. I don't have it on this map, but this is the Korean peninsula is right here. So chilies from that, in that region, were introduced from Korea. And then the Dutch introduced the chili pepper in Taiwan. And one of the ways one of the pieces of evidence that I use for making the argument of separate entry points is the different initial names that the people in those regions developed for the chili pepper. So in Zhejiang, they're called foreign pepper. So an understanding that they're coming from abroad. Up in Shenjing, they're known as chin pepper, which is borrowing a name of an indigenous spicy flavoring. And then in Taiwan, they're called foreign ginger. And I think also that these names imply ways in which people were using them in ways similar to the native Sichuan pepper, or in the case of Taiwan, for ginger. One other thing I want to point out in terms of the introduction, probably they were introduced into that central coastal area of China a little while before we get the first written record, but we can't know that for sure. But typically that would be the case. And so chilies could have arrived in China as early as the 1570s or 1580s. And then one other thing for the long distance introduction. So I mentioned they're not a trade commodity. So there's not crates and crates of them on ships, but obviously they are being spread. And so I think the most likely mechanism for that was that the crews on ships, merchant ships, trading ships, who were used to eating the chili pepper, brought them along on their long voyages to flavor the food that they were eating on board the ship. And shipboard food in this time period was notoriously horrible. So it would make sense that you might want to spice it up with something. And then they're either unintentionally or intentionally spreading seeds when they get to various ports of call. And so it's not a trade item, but it's something that is getting introduced because people were using it. All right, so moving on from the background, I want to look at first the aesthetic use of the chili pepper in China. So its use as, initially its aesthetic use is as a decorative plant. And we can see this in the earliest written source. This is in a text by Cao Xueqin. It's the 8 treatises on nurturing life. This is a very long work that is strongly influenced by Taoism, and Cao Xueqin is talking about ways to enhance one's life experiences. This is his description. So he's the first one that we know of to use, I mean, he's the first source we have, so he's the first one to use this name foreign pepper, fan jiao. And the foreign pepper, the plant has dense growth, the flowers are white, the fruits look just like the worn out tip of a writing brush. Their flavor is spicy, la. Their color is red. They are very pleasing to look at. Propagation results from planting the seeds. So it's a fairly scientific description, identifying the flower, identifying the fruit, but it's also helpful for gardeners to understand that you're gonna propagate it by planting the seeds rather than doing something like taking a cutting. And you know, he acknowledges the spicy flavor, but based on where he placed this description within this very large work, it's it's very clear that he was using them as a decorative plant rather than as a flavoring. So the section where this description occurs is a section on decorative plants. And then he does have fairly extensive sections in the work on food and on traditional Chinese medicine, and the chili pepper, this description is not in those sections. And in another section of the work, he talks about, as part of his sort of cultivation, self-cultivation and reflection on life, that it's important not to eat very spicy food. So it's not surprising that he wouldn't include the chili pepper if he's also avoiding things like garlic and ginger. So we can see this use of the decorative plants continues after that, after, you know, beyond Cao Xueqin, the initial use, and it parallels that initial Spanish use of them as decorative plants. So 1621 text, people plant them in pots as decorations. And in a mid-19th century text, they are shiny and radiant. Many are raised in pots for decoration. And I've seen them used as decorative plants, actually the last time I was in China about 1.5 years ago. They're also a new modern use of it's really probably a 21st century use of the chili pepper as a decoration. And these are long strings of mostly cloth, but they can also be made out of glass or clay. Long strings of chili peppers, and they're put up at Chinese New Year's time. And you can see here in this picture of this small inn, a string on either side of the door for a business, but even more common, it would be a string on either side of the door of a house or an apartment. And the idea here is this phrase "hong hong huo huo," which literally means red, red, fire, fire. But figuratively, or metaphorically, it is a prayer or a wish for the coming year to be exuberant and prosperous. And so that's a very modern use of the chili pepper, continuing in that realm of aesthetics and decoration. All right, so moving on to chilies as a flavoring, this, of course, is the area where the chili had the largest influence and still is the most prominent place that you find chili peppers in Chinese culture. So initially it's getting adopted as a substitute for other spicy flavorings. And that's largely driven by economics and availability. But before I get into that, I want to just point out I think a really interesting parallel, which also helps explain the naming regimen for the chili pepper. So we end up with this term Cao being used for multiple types of spicy flavorings, parts of plants. And this really parallels the English use of the term pepper. So first one is native, the Sichuan pepper or flower pepper. In the earliest texts, this is a single character. That single character, Cao, means this native plant, the Sichuan pepper or flower pepper. It's in the prickly ash family. It's a perennial small tree, and it has a very unique, intense, pungent flavor, but it also has a very strong numbing property. And so if you're familiar with the term in Chinese cooking, particularly in Sichuan, but also in Yunnan, of mala, so numbing and spicy. This is the ma for mala, the native Sichuan pepper or flower pepper. And then black pepper originates in South Asia, so India and Sri Lanka, and gets imported into China around 200. And so they have to come up with a name for it, and the name for it is hujiao. And hu is a very vague term that means the far west. It can also mean India. So essentially we have the spicy flavoring from India. But you can also just think of it also as foreign pepper. And then the third one, we've got a new foreign pepper, the chili pepper. And essentially it follows that same naming pattern that they used for black pepper. And Gaulian uses another term for foreign, fan, and puts that as an adjective in front of Cao. And so we now have another foreign pepper. And then over time, the term that's used predominantly today, la jiao or spicy pepper, becomes more and more common name, and it really by the 19th century has become sort of a national name for the chili pepper. So these are three completely unrelated plants. They're from completely different families. One's a tree, one's a vine, one's an annual short plant. But that intensity of the flavoring is something that is seen as common, and therefore using that common name of Cao. All right, so economics of flavorings. There's sort of three main rivals that the chili pepper is coming in and being a substitute for, that gives it its initial sort of toehold in China. So the native Sichuan pepper, indigenous, widely available, but generally purchased at a market because it's a small tree. Most people would not have room for it in their kitchen or vegetable gardens. So a lot of you are probably familiar with it. In the lower right corner, that's the dried shell of the seed pod, the pericarp of the seed pod, and that's the part that has the spicy, pungent flavoring as well as the numbing characteristic. And then the upper photo is a close-up of you can see a branch with leaves and then some of the seed pods, fresh ones on the tree. So fairly early on in the introduction, we have a specific example, can be substituted for Sichuan pepper. That's from 1671. But I'd argue just the naming regimen, that first name, Fanjiao, is acknowledging that it has a potential similar use in flavoring in food, even if Gaulian himself wasn't eating it, probably other people were. And black pepper, since it's imported from South Asia, probably until the 20th century, and it's expensive because it's imported. And so again, another text from a little bit later in the 1600s, ground very fine. They are used as in the winter months as a substitute for black pepper. And so probably that means that's sort of the low point in the year when the availability of the imported black pepper. And so it's more expensive as the stocks run out, and then the chili pepper becomes a cheap way of substituting for that more expensive spice. The other one is definitely, it's a completely different flavor. In our Western concepts, as well as Chinese concepts of flavoring, salt is not in the same category. Sichuan pepper, black pepper, chili pepper are all in the same pungent category, or Xin, whereas salt, of course, is in the salty category for the Chinese flavoring. But the issue here is really economics. So there's a partial government monopoly on salt, which drives up the price. There is certainly a whole lot of salt smuggling, but obviously the smuggled salt's going to be a little cheaper than the government official salt, but it's still going to be fairly expensive. And then in the 1620s, there's various reasons of major disruptions in the salt business and bankruptcies of salt merchants and salt distributors, and the government's in decline. And the result of that is in the 1620s, as the chili pepper is becoming more and more popular and more widespread, salt prices just dramatically increase. And so I think that's a really great niche then for the chili pepper to move in and become a substitute for this other type of flavoring. And it's important to point out that, biologically, humans need salt, particularly the sodium in salt. And so the chili pepper is not a substitute for that. But we eat way more salt than we need biologically for our body to function properly. And so the chili pepper is serving as a substitute for that larger portion of use of salt that's as a flavoring. And then we can see in the quotation, local minorities use it as a substitute for salt. That's from a gazetteer, a local history from Guizhou. Guizhou is in the south, in the interior. It's one of the only provinces during the Ming and Qing where there was no salt production, and therefore all the salt's being imported into Guizhou from neighboring provinces. And typically that means the price there for salt would have been higher. And so we're definitely seeing that economic issue of using the chili pepper as a substitute for something more expensive. All right, so that's the initial sort of foothold for the chili pepper, is as a substitution. But as people get more used to using it, it gains ground on its own, and it becomes really a flavoring on its own. So, for example, by the 19th century, there are really no sources that talk specifically about the chili pepper as a substitute. So we can see just a couple of the early, this is the 1621 text. That's the earliest text that explicitly talks about the chili pepper in food and also in medicine. The ground fruit is put into food, is extremely pungent and spicy. And so they're not specifically talking about it as a substitute. And then a later, an 18th century source, the pod is sliced and used to flavor food and sauces, vinegar, savory oils, and preserved vegetables. And those are all key components of Chinese cuisine. A lot of flavoring is done through sauces and vinegars and oils, and then also preserved vegetables. And so the chili peppers being integrated into that important way of adding flavoring to dishes. By the mid-18th century, it's really well beyond substitution. And we have these two quotes, we can see that. As indispensable in daily cuisine as onion and garlic. And then the chili pepper is the most important vegetable in the garden. It is used as a daily flavoring, not unlike salt. So we can really see it's come into its own and it's no longer being emphasized as a substitute, particularly as we get into the beginning of the 19th century. All right, so the chilies, of course, can be used fresh also. They can be used as a vegetable. And so in the local gazetteers, these are local histories, really important sources during the late imperial period, so from 1500 to 1900. They're written for the county level, they're written for the prefecture level, and they're written also for the provincial level. In the gazetteers that have chili peppers, that I found chili peppers in, over 80% of them categorize the chili pepper as a vegetable. And similarly, in botanical texts, over 50% of those texts classify them as a vegetable. Other options for classification would be as a spice, as medicine. Those are the main other areas where the chili is classified. And in medical texts, most of them don't use this same categorization system, but of the three that did use that system, two of them categorized it as a vegetable. So this is a source from the middle 19th century just showing that use of them as a vegetable, grown in Jiangxi, Hunan, Guizhou, and Sichuan as a vegetable. There's also a number of sources that talk about people in different parts eating them raw on their own. And then this is a modern sort of tourist image from Shanxi, the photos from Xi'an. So the Chinese, in terms of sort of promoting regional tourism and regional culture, a lot of areas have these lists of things that are sort of unique to that particular culture of that particular region. They're the sort of 8, 10, 12 strange, odd, unique things about Shanxi, Sichuan, Yunnan, wherever. And for Shanxi, this third oddity or unique thing about Shanxi is that the chili pepper can make up an entire dish. So it's not just a flavoring. In this case, it is the dish. And so you can see that nice long strings of chili peppers hanging next to the woman that's cooking here. And then she's got this whole dish full of chili peppers. So we can see that importance of it. Obviously, it's going to add flavor, but it's also a vegetable in these sorts of dishes. I want to just briefly talk about a few of the varieties of chili peppers. One of the interesting things when I was early on in my research presenting on it in China, even Chinese who were historians of China were flabbergasted, some of them were flabbergasted to find out that the chili pepper is not native to China. And I think that's just a really clear sign of how integrated the chili pepper is into Chinese culture. And so, you know, some of them would come up to me after the talk and it's like, are you sure there aren't some chilies that are native to China? It's like, no, there aren't any that are native to China, but the Chinese, of course, have bred them extensively for different varieties. And those are unique to China, or, you know, up until very recently when seeds are spreading all over the world now again. So the varieties the Chinese are selecting for particular shapes, particular colors, and especially for particular flavors. So this is a very popular variety in Sichuan, Cao Xueqin, which is the facing heaven pepper. So it's one that grows upwards. And then just these are Buddha's hand citrus fruits. And then there's a Buddha's hand variety of chili pepper. In this case, with the citrus fruits, it's a single unit. But for the chili pepper, it's just the way the clusters of chilies are growing on that particular variety that made people think of this particular citrus fruit. And then this is a market in Yunnan, in Kunming. So we have a wide variety of chilies available at the market. The spiciest one there up at the top in the center is the spicy rice grain. The lower left, Red Beauty, is also a pretty hot pepper. And, you know, there's just a wide variety of chilies. And even if you go somewhere like Beijing now, which traditionally Beijing food was not spicy, you can now buy probably most of these varieties of chili peppers at a market in Beijing, just showing how that use of spiciness of the chili has spread fairly rapidly in sort of the late 20th, early 21st century. All right, another really important impact on Chinese culture for the chili pepper is in traditional Chinese medicine. And I argue that the classification of the chili pepper within traditional Chinese medicine was important for its taking off and moving into the realm beyond just as a substitute. And particularly, people then knew how to use it both medicinally and in cuisine. And it's important, I mean, many of you would know this, for the Chinese, there's not a clear line of distinction between food and medicine. Anything that you're taking into your body impacts your health. And therefore, a lot of prescriptions in terms of medicine involve food, either food that you're taking in or food that you're avoiding. So the 5 phases is a really important element within traditional Chinese medicine. And within that system, this is a whole series of correspondences or correlations between the categories and different things. So for example, the 5 phases are wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. And you can have 5 directions. They're adding the center as the 5th direction. There's 5 colors, there's 5 flavors. There's different kinds of climate or qi. There's yin organs, there's yang organs, there's various orifices. And we can see in this that chili pepper gets categorized, not surprisingly, in the pungent flavoring, and that falls in the metal category. And therefore, you would expect expect it as a practitioner of Chinese medicine, that it would have some drying capabilities. It would impact the lungs, in the large intestines, and also the nose. And we have a mid-18th century source by Wang Fu. He talks about the pungent flavor drains off the lungs. And so we can see him understanding how the chili pepper fits into this 5 phases categorization within traditional Chinese culture, and also used for traditional Chinese medicine. Here's another example. Without variety in the diet, illnesses can occur. Lesser ones can be treated with ginger and cassia cinnamon. So those are both things that are in that same pungent category. More severe illnesses of the spleen or stomach must be treated with something stronger, the foreign pepper. And so here we can see Wu Qizhuan. He understands the sort of common elements of pungent things for treating particular illnesses. And if it's not reacting to more milder versions like ginger or cassia cinnamon, then you need to move to something stronger. And the chili pepper fits into that category. Whoops. The Yin-Yang system is another really important system in traditional Chinese medicine. In terms of food, it's often associated with temperature in the sense that different food ingredients are seen to have cooling or warming characteristics. And that's the sort of most basic way that it's described. And, not surprisingly, the chili pepper is placed into that warming category. There's some more, a little more complicated version of this as 4 categories. So cold, warm, or cold, cool, warm, and then hot. And again, not surprisingly, but still important for systematically categorizing the chili pepper. It's placed in the hot category. And then there's one other one, 6 categories. They add extremely cold and extremely hot. And again, of course, not surprising that the chili pepper always gets put in that most extreme end of the hot category, so extremely hot. So we can see here's Wang Fu, mid-18th century, talking about it. It has the property of cold expelling heat. It has great pungent and warming properties, and thus can cure those with yang, wind, hemorrhoid sores. It guides fire to move downwards, so that ability to warm the body. There's a modern folk saying that the eating 5 chili peppers is the same as putting on a warm padded cotton jacket. So it'll have a similar warming effect. Even though the chili pepper has a hot characteristic, it can expel heat. So this is sort of like that idea of fighting fire with fire. Wu Zhuyu has the same effect. So what a couple of interesting things we're seeing here is that, one of the characteristics of the capsaicin, the spicy component within the chili peppers, is that it causes sweating. And of course, as sweat evaporates, that's a cooling process, and that can help to cool things down. So even though it's making you feel really hot, it's actually helping to cool down the body and expel heat. And then we also can see here an important parallel, a little bit of an idea of substitution, but it's also helping people who are Wu Zhuyu is something that a traditional Chinese practitioner, medical practitioner would know quite well. And by describing the chili pepper in that way, they're helping them to understand this newer plant and how it can be used. All right, another category is observed effects. So it aids in digestion, it stimulates the appetite. So this very earliest medical text that has the chili pepper in it describes the chili pepper principally. It aids with nighttime digestion of food. In addition, it stimulates the appetite. Just in terms of modern biomedical studies of the chili pepper, capsaicin, that spicy component within the chili pepper, does indeed stimulate salivation, production of saliva. It also stimulates the production of gastric juices in the stomach. Chewing and saliva are the very first stages of digestion. Obviously, gastric juices are important for digestion, but also that salivation and production of gastric juices does indeed stimulate appetite. They also, capsaicin also has an antiseptic, antimicrobial element to it. And we can see this source from Trenzhou on the southern coast of Fujian. It can detoxify poison from aquatic animals. People who eat too much fish or crab and get diarrhea or dropsy can boil the fruit to make a dose of medicinal broth. And then it's also an analgesic, so it helps reduce swelling. It's a treatment. I don't know that I would necessarily use it for this, but in one of the sources it talks about as a treatment for poisonous snake bites. Chew 11 or 12 raw spicy eggplant fruits to reduce swelling and stop pain. The small blisters at the wound site will expel a yellow liquid and then heal. When eating this, the flavor will be sweet, not spicy. Or masticate and place on the wound to reduce swelling and stop the pain. All right, so my sort of whirlwind tour of chilies use in Chinese culture, moving now to chilies in the realm of imagery and literature. The earliest literary reference to chilies came quite early. So we have the earliest description that I quoted earlier by Gao Lian is 1591. And then 1598, very famous author, composer, Tang Shenzhu included a very brief but important mention of chili peppers in his very, very famous opera, The Peony Pavilion. And here we have the first connection of chilies with female passion. So just read a little description of the Peony Pavilion and the use of the chili pepper in that work. Peony Pavilion focuses on romance, passion, sexual frustration, death, and rebirth. The female protagonist, Du Linyang, translated by literary scholar Cyril Birch as Bridal Dew, is an enduring character who has often been held up as a paragon of female passion among readers and in subsequent literary works such as The Dream of the Red Chamber. In the preface to his play, Tang waxed eloquently about her passion. Has the world ever seen a woman's love to rival that of Bridal Dew? Dreaming of a lover, she fell sick. Once sick, she became ever worse. And finally, after painting her own portrait as a legacy to the world, she died. Dead for 3 years, still she was able to live again when in the dark underworld, her quest for the object of her dream was fulfilled. To be as Bridal Dew is truly to have known love. So in scene 23 of this very long opera, if you actually perform the whole thing, it would be something like 18 or 20 hours long. Usually Chinese operatic troops would just perform particular scenes from the opera. In scene 23, Du is in the underworld having her soul judged. Her claims about her death result in the underworld judge summoning the flower spirit from the garden where she had her dream. Shortly after this, Tong has the flower spirit name 38 flowers, with the underworld judge replying in an alternating duet. The judge's replies reflect on some nature of each flower or make a literary reference associated with the flower or pun on the flower's name, and also brings out some erotic suggestion. So, not surprisingly, the chili pepper in here is really, even though it's described as a chili pepper flower, it's really a reference to the fruit. The chili pepper, the line is the flower spirit says chili pepper flower, and then the judge replies, her welcome is warm. And then it's moving it progressively more and more explicit about what's going on in that relationship. But we have that first use of the chili pepper being connected with female passion. And that's going to continue in later uses of chili pepper imagery for the female gender all the way up to the present. So I see her then, even though Tong does not use the term, this is a term that's used in modern periods, is Bridal Dew is that first example of a la maid's, a spicy girl or spicy woman. So the 18th century novel, The Dream of the Red Chamber by Cao Xueqin, definitely has references back to Peony Pavilion. And there's a very strong female character in that novel, Wang Shifeng. And she is associated with chili peppers. Her sobriquet or nickname is Feng Lazi, or chili pepper Feng. And it is sobriquet for her chosen for her because of her very fiery personality. And because of that fiery personality and disposition, she's chosen to be the manager for this extraordinarily wealthy household. And so she's in charge of the purse strings for a very large household that has a very large income. So she's got a lot of power within that family. This is my favorite Chinese painting of chili pepper. There aren't very many of them. It's by the 20th century Chinese artist Ye Qianyu. And this is his portrait of Wang Shifeng. So he's painted her as a red hot chili pepper. And then we look the very late 20th century, and this song is still pretty popular all the way up to the present. It's called La Meizi. The most popular version of it is by the singer Song Zuying. And in this song, it talks about the importance of chili pepper in shaping the character of women. And in particular, this one would be referencing women from Hunan. La maids are also sometimes used for describing women from Sichuan, so two provinces where there's a lot of chili pepper eating. So for these spicy girls, spicy young women, they're eating the chili pepper. Describes some of the lines from the songs, from the song. From youth, they're unafraid of spice. With a handful of chilies, they speak their minds. Their passion is spicy. When they speak, it's fiery, spicy, spicy. When they do things, it's bold, spicy, spicy. And when they interact, it's hot, spicy, spicy. So we can see that carry over from Bridal Dew through Feng Lazi and The Dream of the Red Chamber up to this present version of La Meizi. It's in the end, the modern version is definitely a more positive take and sort of seen as active women with a lot of agency and ability to work on their own. There's also male tropes associated with the chili pepper, and they involve sort of virility, warfare, militancy, revolution, and they're also very directly associated with Mao. So this is a photo of the front page of a menu of a Sichuan restaurant in Beijing. And you know, they're very wholeheartedly endorsing Mao as an element for this restaurant of promoting Hunan restaurant. Mao's from Hunan originally. And so emphasizing that his desire for eating spicy food was really, really important for his character. There's a line from him, revolution would not have been possible without the chili pepper. And there's also a lot of places where he associates his ability as a leader, as a military leader, as a revolutionary with that ability to eat chilies. He pretty much scorned people who didn't have an ability to eat chilies and sort of enjoyed inflicting them on them. He also, at one point, one of his doctors suggested that perhaps he was eating too many chilies, and Mao, you know, quipped back at him, if I'm afraid of a few peppers in my bowl, how can I go out and face my enemies? And so we get this emphasis then on that male virility, fighting capability, revolutionary capability, and it's very, very directly associated with Mao and with Hunan. All right, so I'm gonna wrap things up. The ability of the chili pepper to have such a big impact on Chinese culture really resulted from the Chinese identifying that it had multiple characteristics, and it was flexible, and there's a whole variety of different things that they could use the chili pepper for. Obviously flavoring, but as I said, food and medicine, there's not a clear line of distinction. So even when you're just using them as flavoring, it's important to understand what impact they would have on health. And then we can also see them being used symbolically in terms of gender stereotypes and expectations of how what you eat can impact your character and your behavior. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian, for that fascinating talk. And I'd like to thank our audience for submitting some of your questions in advance. Looks like we have a few questions already. And for everyone else in the audience, if you do have questions, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. So let's start off with, let's see, a question sent in by Linda. She's asking here, is the pepper tree that grows wild in some parts of Florida any relation to the Sichuan pepper that you might know of?
So there are indeed prickly ash native in the Americas. So that's probably, I'm not positive that's what you're referring to down in Florida, but there are definitely relatives of that Sichuan pepper tree that are also native in the Americas in the US. And I do know that some Native American tribes would use that seed shell and chew on it as a way of dealing with toothaches. So they're taking advantage of that numbing property.
Okay, great. So chili peppers are high in vitamin C, By chance, did the early sailors who may have brought the chili peppers to China or around the world, did they know about the high vitamin C or that it helped prevent scurvy on the long voyages?
I think I mean, of course, they did not scientifically understand what vitamin C was and what exactly it was doing in the body and its need in the body. I do think, similarly to the British sailors being described as limeys because they'd eat limes on the long voyages. I think it's probably something that was a sort of a process of elimination or observed effect, that people were eating chilies and not getting scurvy. So probably there was some use of that. It's just there aren't any detailed records that would tell us that they were doing it explicitly. But I do think it makes sense. A lot of the things in the ways that once the chili's in China, the ways in which it gets used medically, a lot of those were based on observation. And I think probably some of the sailors figured out that this was something that was useful in that.
Okay. Here's another one kind of along the lines of medicine. So prior to the widespread availability of the foreign peppers, what was used medicinally to treat stomach illness?
Um, so I'm not a huge expert on Chinese medicine, but a lot of these things would have used other flavorings or other plants that have that are in that same category of pungent. So ginger would have been a really obvious one that would get used for that sort of thing. Sichuan pepper is also in that category, but I think in terms of like a stomach ailment, ginger would actually is a really common ingredient in traditional Chinese medicine. Um, Turmeric also gets used, and it would be in that same category. It's not as widely available in China as ginger, but it would have been something that would have been used as well.
Marcia is asking, how much variation in flavor and intensity is there with the Sichuan peppers that are available here in the US compared to those in China?
Um, it can be, they can vary quite a bit. I mean, they can vary quite a bit in China too. So I recently actually ordered some, or I guess it was last year, I ordered some from Mala Market, which is a great source for Chinese, particularly Sichuanese ingredients in the US. And they actually have one of their varieties of Sichuan pepper, which is a lot more pungent than I'm used to. So the first time I used it, I pretty much put way too much in the dish and overpowered everything with the Sichuan pepper flavor. And so it can vary quite a bit. There are, of course, varieties. You're more likely to be able to get different varieties in China. The one I haven't seen much of in the US that you can get in China are green ones. So they're picked before they're ripe, and it has a little different flavor than the ripe ones. And I think a lot of it is how old they are. So the fresher ones, not surprisingly, have a more intense flavor than if they've been sitting around in a bag for a while. And that's probably a lot of it. I think until very recently that it wasn't actually that, for a period of time, Sichuan pepper was illegal in the US. It was categorized as I think it was seen as potentially having hallucinogenic properties or something like that. I forget exactly the reason why it wasn't allowed to be imported. It is now allowed to be imported. As far as I know, it does not have any sort of recreational drug aspects to it. But I do think you can get obviously more varieties in China, but I think the biggest difference in the ones that you can get here is just how fresh they are, how long ago since they were picked.
Eric writes, thanks for a great presentation. There was a photo of a string of peppers hung on either side of a doorway in the beginning, and in it was called Longzhao Yun Yin. Can you tell us what town that inn is in?
Oh, it's in Yunnan. It's in Lijiang, in Yunnan.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Was that one of your personal photos?
Yeah, it is.
Great. Marta writes, can you tell us how you became interested in this unique topic and where did you do your research?
Sure. So I was in Beijing a while ago, eating in a Sichuan restaurant, and I knew the chili pepper was originally an American crop. And I just started thinking to myself and wondering, how did the Chinese start to eat the chili pepper? Typically, certainly in the early, pre-modern era, cuisine is a fairly conservative part of culture, and so it seemed to me that it was interesting that the Chinese would adopt something with such a unique and such an intense flavor. And so that was my initial question: is how did that happen? And I hopefully somewhat answered that today. I do think that substitution was really important, but once it had gained popularity, it became popular on its own. Research a number of libraries in the US and a number of libraries in China. I also spoken with a number of people, including traditional medicine practitioners, chefs, not a lot of that, but a little bit of interviewing. A really, really important source that I quoted from a couple of them during the talk were these gazetteers or regional histories. Chinese are called difangzhi. And those were really important because they talk about what's going on at the local level. They're not completely reliable as a mechanism for, say, tracing the exact movement of the introduction of the chili pepper, because the chili pepper has to get on the radar of the authors. And of course, by definition, that the authors are members of the elite. And I didn't talk about it in detail in this talk, but the chili pepper definitely gets adopted more readily and more quickly by the lower classes in cuisine than it does by the elite. And so, given that they are not really, as a whole group, not that thrilled with eating chilies, it can take a while for the chilies, even though it might be in all these being eaten by all sorts of people, it takes a while for it to work its way into the writings. But it's still a really important resource. Another thing that was really important for this study was my ability to be able to access digitized collections of traditional Chinese sources. The longest source I have for chili peppers is like 3.5 pages long, and that is by far the longest. Most of them are under a page, and a lot of the entries in the gazetteers are just the name of the chili pepper and nothing else. And given that sparsity of sources, which again relates back to the elite reluctance to eat the spicy pepper, given that lack of evidence, I needed to search a lot of sources And the ability to do that in a lifetime is saved by that digitizing of collections. And that helped tremendously. So there's actually a huge collection of gazetteers, those local histories that have been digitized. And so you can do a full text search for different names of chilies. And that helped a lot, that I was able to track down a lot of sources that would have taken me just far too long on my own, looking through the books themselves.
Jung Hee writes, you've talked or mentioned about chilies being introduced from Korea. Do you know how and when the chili was introduced first to Korea?
I do. There's some Korean nationalists who think the chili peppers are actually indigenous to Korea. That is not true. They're from the Americas originally, but like the Chinese, they of course have adapted and bred varieties, and of course they're really, really important in Korean cuisine and kimchi. So probably, almost certainly, the chili pepper was introduced to Korea from Japan during Hideyoshi's invasion of Korea in the 1590s. And then they took off pretty quickly in terms of their popularity in Korea from that point. And then eventually they're going to spread from Korea across the Yalu River into northwest China, or northeast China, sorry. Yeah.
Candace asks, were chili peppers ever part of the famous spice trade?
No, the chili peppers didn't get that way. Columbus really, obviously that's where he was trying to get to. And so when he didn't get there, he was hoping that maybe something he'd found in the Americas would work as a substitute and make him lots of money. And he wrote in his journal that he expected to be able to do that with the chili pepper, but clearly he ran into the problem of the European palate not yet being ready for chili peppers. And so it is not something that gets traded as a trade commodity really until we get into the 20th century. And so my argument, as I mentioned, is that they're spread by people, the crew members on merchant ships who might have been participating in the spice trade, bringing the chili pepper in the galley, in the kitchen on the ship as flavoring for their food, and as somebody mentioned with the question, and potentially also as a way of preventing scurvy.
A viewer writes, thank you, I enjoyed the presentation very much. Are the chilies used today in China exclusively annuum or annuals?
They have had introductions of some of the other species. And the Chinese are also growing some of these crazy super hot chilies, scorpion chilies or ghost pepper, things like that. They're not used very widely, but they are definitely available. But that's a pretty recent, probably late 20th century and even early 21st century, that those other varieties have been introduced.
Okay. Pamela asks a question about the chili seeds versus the meat, and says, sometimes the chili seeds are used instead of the meat in many recipes. Is there specificity in dishes or recipes along these lines? And I'm also personally wondering if the seeds were referenced differently than, say, the meat in literature.
This is getting a little out of my realm in terms of, I like to cook Chinese food, but I'm by far not an expert. Certainly the historical texts that I've looked at, and including some that have recipes, the recipes are not very detailed. and they do not make a distinction between the fleshy part and the seeds. I would think that might be a phenomenon that is a more modern phenomenon where you could see some of that distinction. And of course, the capsaicin is concentrated in essentially the placenta of the fruit, which is the little white membrane that's connecting the seeds to the fleshy part of the fruit. That's where the capsaicin is concentrated. So if you're trying to reduce the spiciness of a particular chili, that part can be cut out and not included. If you really want to have it, then you definitely need to keep that part of the chili in there. And there, of course, there's different, dried versus fresh. And then if they're dried, if they're ground, there's a difference in the way that impacts the flavoring of the dish.
Kind of speaking along the lines of chili pepper as a food entity, a viewer writes, are the milder chili peppers varieties that we have now later developments from the earlier hot ones, or did they exist earlier?
There's definitely sources, Chinese sources talk about, they call it the persimmon pepper, which is essentially a bell pepper. Certainly by the 19th century, I suspect that the introduction of chilies, they would initially have had multiple varieties coming from the Americas. And certainly there's a wide variety of them available to be spreading around the world. So I think they're initially getting ones with a range of spiciness, and they certainly by the 19th century and probably a little bit earlier than that are getting ones that are essentially not spicy. So that bell pepper type.
Great. It looks like we're almost out of time. I think we have time maybe for 2 more questions. And for those who are still with us, at 11 o'clock or perhaps 11:05, we'll be switching over to our first Saturday virtual tea house. So let's get to a couple more questions. Here a viewer writes, thank you for the interesting talk. As a witty alum from 1959, I'm so proud to hear the quality of your presentation. I'm curious to know about your Chinese language studies. Where and when did you study Chinese?
Oh, sure. So I started at the very end of my undergraduate career studying Chinese. That was at the University of Minnesota. I did a summer program at the University of Wisconsin, and then also took Chinese classes at the University of Michigan and University of Pittsburgh. So sort of Midwest tour of learning Chinese. And then I also did a year-long advanced Chinese program in Taiwan. At that point, this was called the Stanford Center. It was based at Taiwan National University, Taida, but it was specifically for training non-native speakers of Chinese. And that program still exists, but it's now based at Tsinghua University in Beijing.
Okay, and then one final question. Towards the end of your talk, you mentioned about Mao being from Hunan and someone who loved spicy food. And so I'm curious about whether chili peppers were used in his kind of marketing or as propaganda symbols for the revolution movement.
I really wish they had, but not really. So the chili pepper in terms of art representations is one area where it doesn't have a huge impact really until very, very recently. So I have yet to find a traditional Chinese painting from, you know, prior to the 20th century that includes chili peppers. If anyone knows of one, I'd love to hear about it. And then woodblock prints, there's a few chili pepper representations, but not very many. It's a good question. I don't know why it doesn't get picked up by the communists as a symbol. You know, it's nice and red. Or red communists, Mao loved it. But I've not seen any posters, propaganda posters that really promote it. It's more of a oral emphasis, you know, talk about the impact of it rather than having a visual representation of it. But if you know of any, I'd love to see those too.
Well, thank you very much, Brian, for a really fascinating presentation today and taking time to answer the questions from our audience. I see we're at the end of our time, and I apologize to those in the audience who we weren't able to get to all of your questions. We will now be transitioning from our talk to the optional First Saturday Virtual Tea House. And if you are new to First Saturday, it's a monthly program series, and you can find more information about our presentations on our website, firstsaturdaypdx.org. You are welcome to subscribe to our email list to receive the regular announcements about upcoming events. And so we look forward to having new people join us all the time. And again, we'd like to thank our speaker. Let's see, our First Saturday Tea House will start in about 5 or 10 minutes. So we encourage everybody to grab a cup of tea and rejoin us in about 5 minutes. And our speaker will be able to join us. So the First Saturday Tea House, everybody comes together and then we break out into smaller groups, and our guest speaker will be able to spend about 5 to 8 minutes or so joining each of the small groups for some conversation. The slide you see here shows how to get to the tea house. So you'll exit today's webinar, leave it, click on the leave button at the bottom of the screen, go back to your email confirmation and click on the second link at the lower part of your email email that you received. So again, Brian, thank you so much. And I look forward to chatting with you more in the tea house in a few minutes.
I very much enjoyed it.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We had a record turnout of about 85 people. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.